Okay, so the next part of this project is the second layer. Remember, we're following the three-step approach, so we're going to be building the painting in three layers. Just as a reminder, this process is based in the idea of fat over lean, meaning that if you want your oil paintings to last and not crack, each layer of your painting should have a little bit more oil painting medium or linseed oil added to it to make it more flexible than the layer underneath. We're also following this for acrylic because it gives your painting sort of a particular look. You're adding body to your paint as you're going up within each layer. It's going to help you learn how to control your paints a little bit more and also how to use your matte medium. The idea of painting in this process also because it helps your painting to be archival or withstand the effects of time. So you should have already completed the first pass. Remember, during that pass, you covered the white areas quickly. You looked for main shapes and colors. This is your raw data, sometimes called a local color underpainting. You're basically looking for each basic color shape and a hue and a shadow. And on this layer, you should have added Gamsol if you were using oil paints for fluidity, or the idea, if your paint's going on nice and easily onto the canvas or paper. And if you're using acrylic paint, you should have used water for fluidity. So your first layer should look something like this. It shouldn't look neat, right? There might be some little blips or you might see some of your drawing underneath, especially if you use charcoal pencil. Sort of a little bit messy looking, and that's totally okay. That's how it's supposed to look. Now today you're doing the second pass. So in the second pass, you're going to return to each color area and look for more details within the hues. So we're not just looking at one color for the shadow. We're going to try to look at how the shadow changes, how it maybe gets darker and bluer as it gets closer to the edge, how it gets lighter and warmer as it moves away from it. We're also going to think about things that are caused by reflective color or simultaneous contrast or variations in how light falls across each object. So you can kind of think about how the color has little subtle changes as it gets to the highlight or, all those kinds of details you didn't get to focus on in the first pass. This pass, you're looking at perceptual color, or the subtle changes in the way the color looks. So your second layer will look something like this. It's a lot more detailed. It's not totally done, but you'll see a lot more detail within the highlights and shadows. Now on this layer, if you're using oil paint, your second layer you should be mixing linseed oil with your paints for fluidity. So fluidity is where the paint is, when you apply it, it goes smoothly across the surface. You're just going to add a few drops for fluidity. We're also going to mix linseed oil with our paints for transparency. So transparency is how see-through your paint is. So the more linseed oil, the more see-through my paint becomes. And we want to do this so that we can subtly change the color. Remember, we're looking for those kind of little hints or changes within the color. So we may not have to totally cover an area. Again, we might want to just slightly change it or alter it a little bit. For acrylic paint, for your second layer, you should be using your matte medium. Now the matte medium, you're going to use this instead of water. You're going to add a couple drops for fluidity. Now, the reason why you're adding matte medium to this layer, you know, acrylic paint is essentially pigment that's bound together in a plastic resin. That plastic resin is matte medium. When you add water to acrylic paint, it's actually breaking apart the binding that's in the acrylic. So it has kind of a streakier look to it. It sort of has a thinner, flatter look to it. When you add the matte medium, it makes it so it's more bountiful and it allows light to reflect through it more. So once you're done with that first layer, you should be trying not to add water to your paints anymore. Um, you're also going to mix matte medium with your paints for transparency. So same thing, we don't want to put water because water's going to thin it out and make it streaky. We want to see through. We're going to use the matte medium so it gives it sort of a more bountiful, glowing kind of look. It's going to allow light to reflect through it. And it's going to give you a more even transparency. So we're going to start with our palette again. Now you might remix some of the same colors you did from the first time around if I'm trying to refine it or slightly alter a color. But I also want to mix some colors where I'm going to use them to, say, deepen a shadow. So maybe I'll mix a bluey brown that I want to add in to deepen some shadows. Or maybe I'll have a nice lighter, cooler white that I'm going to add to some of my highlights. So I'm going to have them kind of pre-mixed up. And those are the ones that I can use to add transparencies, right? Where I want to subtly alter or change things. So this is my linseed oil. Now you can see I'm kind of adding a little bit to my palette. If you have a squeeze bottle, we're going to use that actually in the second painting. But you can use that for your linseed oil as well, but don't fill it totally up, only put a little bit in. So you can see if I wanted transparency, I'm taking some of my paint and adding it to the linseed oil. If I was adding it for fluidity, I would take just a couple drops and add that into the paint itself. But if I want it to be a transparency that I'm coming in with, I can actually put some of the linseed oil or matte medium down on my palette and add some paint into it until it's the transparency that I want. And just to give you an idea, here's a detail. That's the transparency brown that I mixed. I just want to kind of darken my shadow area a little bit. I'm putting it on with one brush. And then I can actually take a second dry brush and sort of thin it out and blend it to the area around it. So that's a brush that's totally dried. It's not wet at all. And it's going to allow me to blend. The dry brush technique is nice because you can kind of, you'll see in the sped up version, you can kind of blend out some overall areas. And some of the things I'm going to clean up in this layer, you can see some of my drawing still showing through. That's something that I'm going to come back through and clean up during this layer. So let's see. Here's the sped up version. So you can see I'm starting in on that shadow first. And I'm just altering the color. I decided I wanted to warm up that yellow in some places too, so I did transparency in some of those areas to kind of warm it up. I'm also going in and refining edges, so I've remixed some of the same color. If you want to paint opaquely, you can not add anything to your paint at all. You could just add, just a little drop of linseed oil or matte medium at this point. And the idea is, it's as transparent or as opaque as you need it. So sometimes you need more coverage, sometimes you just want to slightly alter here and there. That's sort of your overall goal for this layer. Sometimes if you have a really bright color you want to get, that can only be done through layering. So my red is one of those areas that's really bright. So you can notice how much more pop it has to it now that I've sort of layered on a more transparent red layer over top of it. This isn't going to be finished after this layer still. Don't try to get into the nitty gritty details. You're just going to try to go in and refine things up and deepen shadows, lighten highlights. The one thing about oil and acrylic painting is you can kind of overdo it sometimes where you're trying to work when it's too wet. That's part of the 3-layer approach, is that you're sort of pausing after the layer's done, letting it dry, and then coming back in and working over top of it. So doing that is actually going to allow you to get more detailed, take a step back from it, and go in and kind of work those areas that you still need to work. So The next phase that you're going to go on to, we're not going to go over it right now, but some of you might get to the point this week where you're starting to go into the third and final pass. This is the final stage of your painting, remember? It's where you're looking for the small details. It's also known as the pictorial path because you're looking for those details as a whole. You're trying to think about color harmony, overall little final finishing details. For this painting, we're still just going to add linseed oil or matte medium. Next painting you do, we're going to mix some other mediums and use those Retarder and Damar varnish that you have in your kit. But for this painting, we're just going to keep with those two mediums. So this should be your finished final layer where all those details come into play. So like I said, the idea is that you're not trying to get everything done at once. You're building those details with each passing layer.